A topic of discussion is likely to be the situation on the ground over in Iran. Take a look at these photos here that are now coming into our newsroom, courtesy the U.S. Navy. Now, the U.S. Navy releasing the photos of the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Indian Ocean. This comes after President Trump announced Wednesday morning that a major armada was headed to Iran, including the USS Abraham Lincoln. Reuters reporting this morning via sources that President Trump is weighing his options against Iran, including targeted strikes on security forces and leaders there to inspire protesters. Those sources saying the president is looking to create conditions for, quote, regime change following a crackdown on the nationwide protests. Activists report over 6,100 deaths during the protests, with many more deaths likely. A lot to discuss as this all does play out here. Do want to bring in Javed Ali, Associate Professor of Practice at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Now, he's worked with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI. Thank you so much, Javed Ali, as always, for being here with us.
Josh, great to be with you this morning as always as well.
And first off, I want to start by talking about this armada situation. We heard on Truth Social from President Trump just about 24 hours ago as he said this major armada was headed over to Iran. What does that signal to us, if anything?
So, Josh, going back a couple of weeks when I was on with you then, we were talking about the potential for the U.S. to initiate a military campaign against Iran in the aftermath of the terrible crackdown the Iranian government imposed inside Iran. You described the toll that it has taken in Iran, and going back to that period of time, there was the potential for military operations to begin with most likely airstrikes from multiple locations throughout the region with the U.S. Resources and capabilities and assets that were there. But now here we are 2 weeks later, and with the USS Abraham Lincoln and its the other ships that are part of that carrier battle group that are likely now in the Indian Ocean or other parts of closer to the Persian Gulf, that gives the president even more firepower to consider if he were to order a military campaign against Iran. And now the question is, with the Lincoln battle group on station or near the Persian Gulf, will President Trump go through with that, and what will a military campaign look like?
One thing that's interesting is we saw kind of the strong words coming from President Trump as those protests took place, and we saw executions, essentially, people killed there in the streets for taking part in the protests. And right now, activists saying about 6,100 deaths have been confirmed, but also adding that number is likely higher. So that death toll, the protests, what kind of role is all of that playing in President Trump's decision making? Do we know?
So the protests that were so terrible on the ground, I mean, the death of the protesters on the ground in Iran, I mean, this was an unprecedented crackdown by the Iranian government on its own people, using its military, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the paramilitary force, the Basiji, probably other elements of Iran's security services, all killing its own citizens in the numbers you described. And that is what got us to that brink going back a couple of weeks ago of the U.S. initiating military operations. But now the crackdown, as far as we can tell, is over. There doesn't appear to be another wave of these protests happening and a likewise similar crackdown. So now the question will be, if a campaign does get launched, will the U.S. go after all those security elements that I just described that were responsible for the crackdown previously? And will that be then another opening or signal for another wave of protest, which then would potentially be big enough to perhaps force the supreme leader and his inner circle to flee the country? These are all things it's really hard to know, but those security elements aren't on the ground in large numbers the way they probably were a couple of weeks ago. So that's something the White House and the U.S. military are probably thinking through right now.
Do we know if there's any real open communication between the U.S. and Iran at this time? Because we've seen, of course, President Trump posting about all of this. We've also seen the Supreme Leader's Twitter or X page where there's statements pretty much coming out daily against Trump. So is there even an open line of communication as far as we know?
So there's the public facing rhetoric that you described that's playing out on social media, and that's not new. I mean, that's been going on for years with the Iranian government against any presidential administration for quite some time. But there's been a lot of media reporting that also in this long stretch of time, there are these back channels for communication between the U.S. and Iran, and they can happen even on the ground in a place like Qatar or Oman. Those governments have seemed to be locations where Iranian officials and or U.S. officials can meet, or one side meets in one location and the message gets passed from there. So is that kind of a quiet diplomacy happening in countries like that? Or are there other locations in the Middle East or other parts of the world where those kind of that kind of diplomacy is happening? I haven't seen the most recent reporting on that, but it wouldn't surprise me if that is going on behind the scenes. But President Trump has said that with now more U.S. military power in the region, that there are these three demands from the U.S. government that the Iranian government must accede to in order for a campaign not to happen. Iran needs to cease all uranium enrichment. It needs to pull back on its ballistic missile and drone program, and it needs to cease all support to its proxies and partners in that axis of resistance from Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and militias in Iraq and Syria. So those are the terms the U.S. has imposed on Iran. Now we're going to have to wait and see how Iran reacts to those terms.
And of course, this is going to be a pivotal few hours, days, possibly weeks here. What do we need to be watching for as far as key indicators of what's next?
So the rhetoric from both sides, both from the U.S. side with President Trump and other senior officials, and the rhetoric on the other side from the Supreme Leader, senior officials in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, perhaps the Foreign Ministry, the tone and tenor of those statements are potentially an indicator. Clearly, if there's other media reporting about even more U.S. military resources pouring into the region or being positioned in the region, or preparations even for operations that could happen from the U.S. or be launched from the U.S. or other parts of the world, that could be another indicator. And then the situation on the ground in Iran. Is this a signal for the protest movement in Iran to start again? And it's hard to know the answer to that, but those to me would all be strategic indicators of what potentially could happen next.
Javed Ali, as always, we appreciate your insight here. Anything you want to add, anything we missed? I know we covered a lot of ground, but anything you want to add before I let you go?
So going back to a couple of weeks when you and I spoke about this, I thought we were really close to this moment where the U.S. would actually begin that military campaign. And that moment has passed, but here we are now. And I think we're another one of these inflection points where it's very likely it could happen. But will it lead to the kind of change or effects that the U.S. would hope, even or thinks would happen, even if the military campaign happens? And President Trump apparently has stated regime change might be the goal. So not with boots on the ground, but again, putting enough pressure on the Supreme Leader and his inner circle to leave the country or that somehow get overthrown internally. So that, I think, is something we're all going to have to just see how that plays out if a campaign actually does start.
All right. Javed Ali there at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us as always.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
And I do want to remind you, this is likely to be one topic of discussion among many likely to hear about Minneapolis as well, as that 11 a.m. Eastern Time cabinet meeting for President Trump and his cabinet gets underway. Cameras allowed inside, so we're going to bring you all the action, the remarks there, and President Trump likely to take part in a Q&A with reporters once it's all done.